So this is another Intigriti challenge based off a real-life vulnerability, this time created by a guy called GrumpinouT, who is also doing this as part of his research for his bachelor's degree. So jumping right in, I'm actually going to start this one off a little bit differently to normal. So normally I would kind of run through the application, run through how it works, look through the source code, see if I can find anything interesting. But in this case, it's dead simple. Basically, it comes down to just 2 lines of code. So if we scroll down, we can basically see it's just this capture down here in the bottom left. It takes the 2 numbers, the entire operation, passes it into an eval and checks if it was the correct answer or not. And basically, that's it. Your input ends up in an eval. And the only other interesting part is that, well, we can put anything we want in there except from any of these characters inside of this regex. So first thing also to mention is that this is actually an iframe down here, so we can just kind of access it directly. And just by setting this C parameter in the URL, we can just set whatever value we want, and it gets put straight into this input field. So there's no way to auto submit this form. So this is not going to be 0 clicks. This is going to be 1 click. Someone's going to have something come in here, click submit, and then somehow we're going to end up with XSS. But apparently that's how this was designed. And obviously if we had any kind of issue like click jacking, then, this would still be, significantly high impact. So if we look over the characters that we have filtered out, so this is what's taken directly out of the source code, and let's try something that we might want to put into an eval, right? So let's say we end off any original input, and we probably want to do an alert, and let's do the full document.domain like the challenge wants us to do. And you can see almost every character here is not allowed through, with a few exceptions. There's one really interesting one, which is the fact that E is allowed through. It's specifically mentioned in the source code that the letter E is allowed through. But pretty much outside of that, we're very heavily filtered here. So my immediate first thought whenever coming into a limited character set is this idea of JSFuck, which is basically the ability to write JavaScript, execute anything in JavaScript using these 6 characters here. Just 6 characters can write anything you want in JavaScript. And I actually created a video way back in 2018 fully explaining this. This was way before I was into security. I was just a developer who happened to hear about this, and I thought it was super interesting, and I wanted to go away and figure out how it worked. So I ended up creating this video. So I'm fairly well versed on how JSFuck works as a result. Now, firstly, we only have 3 of these 6 characters available, right? So we have got access to use those square brackets, but we don't have access to use the exclamation mark or the circle brackets. We do also have this plus here. It's also a 17-minute long video that I don't want to go through all the way from beginning to end, but there are a lot of things that we need to take from this, right? This is a system built around using very few characters, and we can take a lot of inspiration from that. So let's go over the absolute basics of JSFuck, right? So the idea is that you can write using only 6 characters in JavaScript, whatever you could possibly imagine, right? And the way that we do that is by abusing a couple of features of JavaScript. Let's say we want to express false to JavaScript, right? We don't have access to just write the word false. So we're gonna have to express this some other way using that very limited character set. So how could we do that? So basically one thing we have access to is an empty array here, right? But that's not very useful. We're just expressing an empty array. However, this empty array is considered a truthy value, right? So if we turn this into a Boolean, we'll see that it gets turned into true. Now we can't turn this empty array into a Boolean because we don't have all those characters, the B, the double O, L, whatever else. But what we can do is we have access to this exclamation mark. Now what that's going to do is it's going to check whatever you give that exclamation mark and try and reverse whatever it is. Now it expects to be dealing with Booleans, and so JavaScript is automatically going to take that empty array, convert it into a Boolean, and then reverse that Boolean. So since we're dealing with a true value, which is, as I said, that empty array, it then gets converted into true and then reversed into false. And now if we want to express ourselves, let's say we want to write the word true, we can just do the opposite of that. We say not, and then our empty array, which is true. If it's not true, then it is true, right? So we get our true output here as well. So we're already using a very limited character set and getting different results here. But what exactly is it useful for? Well, before we get onto how truly useful it is, let's go over the basics, right? So let's see if we can do something else with this. So let's say we want to turn the word true into a string. Well, how would we do that? There's actually a couple of ways we can do it. We can try and just add an empty string on, right? So we have access to those characters, right? We can create strings, and now it's going to turn it into true, right? And why would that be useful? Well, because now we can take that entire string that we just created and we can treat that as if it's an array, because strings in JavaScript are array-like. They're basically just arrays of characters. So we can now get any character individually that we want. Another way we can turn it into a string is to use this template literal syntax, right? So we can just pass whatever we put into this template literal, it's always going to spit us out a string. So if we put, let's go back again and put false in, you can see it instantly got turned into false, and then we can just immediately, again, access these individual characters. So let's do some more interesting things, right? All right, let's create the word undefined, right? So if we just give it an empty array and then we try and access the first element in that empty array, it's empty. So it gives us undefined, right? So we now have access to the string undefined. So let's start spelling words out here, right? So we've got access to false, and let's get our L, and let's do the same thing here, but then we will pass in instead L, and let's go for this. Second would be LA, and then we will add one from undefined. So we can get the D here. So we now create the word lad, right? And we're just using these weird characters, right? That doesn't represent the word lad at all to a human, but when you pass it to JavaScript in the way that we've done, we can create the string lad. All right, now is for the truly useful part. We understand the basics, how we're going to get different strings and put them together. Now we get onto the truly useful part, right? So as part of my JS fuck video, I mentioned that we can basically turn strings into functions, which we can then execute, right? And the way that we can do that is by abusing a different feature in JavaScript. That's basically just by abusing the object structure, right? So let's just say we go with an empty array. Well, an empty array has a method on it. It has many methods on it, but one of those is called fill, for example. We use that. It's a very simple thing, but there are loads of different ways that we could get to this, right? So we're going to use the fill method because that is a function, and then we could just call .constructor on that. So we're saying we want to access this array, go to the fill method. We don't actually invoke it. That's why we're not using these curly brackets. We're just literally accessing that method on this array. And then we're going to the constructor, which is, again, another function, right? We can see that it's a function. And this function is basically going to allow us to pass in any string we want here and have it construct you a new function from that, right? So let's say we did alert1. So we can see it actually did create us that function, but it's just an anonymous function, so there's not much use. But we could just immediately invoke that function that the constructor just handily created for us, and there we go. We're getting our alert box. We're now running JavaScript via a string. But let's not lose sight of what we're trying to do here, right? There's so many characters in here that we can't access. So let's see how much of this we can actually clean up, right? So what can we do here? So firstly, this is not a string, right? We already know we can create strings, but this here is not a string. If it were a string, it would be within quotes. Well, that's not going to work because JavaScript doesn't work like that. However, there is a syntax that you can use that does take a string, and that is this square bracket syntax, right? So if we do the exact same thing here, and we pass in fill, you see it worked, right? But in this case, we got a real actual string to be the value of fill. So now we'll do the exact same thing, but we'll do that for the constructor. And now we can execute that. Still, it executes. So now we are basically just using a few characters other than the strings that we're not allowed to use, right? So if we go back in here, again, ignore these strings for now. In fact, let's just literally delete them because we already know we can generate those strings in a way that doesn't require us actually having to type them. The only things left are these brackets. Well, again, there's more tricks in JavaScript. We can, instead of using these brackets, use backticks, which actually are allowed. We can use backticks to basically replace our curly brackets. Now, the reason this actually works is because of something called template literals, right? So this is basically a new, well, fairly new feature in ECMAScript, which allows you to use this different kind of syntax to call functions. Now, there's some nuance to this. It's not exactly the same as just invoking the function normally. There are some differences, and we are going to have to account for that at some point. But for now, all we need to really worry about is that we can invoke the function using these backticks. So now we're off to a really good start, right? We already know that basically all of the boilerplate of this, these square brackets, we have access to, right? And in terms of these strings, we know we can generate strings using our kind of concatenation stuff over here that all uses characters that will get through that regex check. So now basically our goal is to try and get as many characters as possible to see if we can create all of the strings we see here. We need access to all the characters in fill, constructor, and alert1. So we already know that we can create undefined by calling an empty array and trying to get the first element. Well, another thing we could do is just literally stringify this empty object, right? Again, they're valid characters, and so now we've got access to all of these characters as well. And now here's a very interesting one. Don't forget, we've also got access to E, right? So E is actually has an ID inside of the HTML. So if you ever seen my previous Intigriti challenge video with DOM clobbering, if you have anything with an ID or a name set to a specific value, it's accessible through the window object as a global variable. So in this case, we've got ID equals E, and that allows us to just call E here. So let's stringify that again using our template literal syntax, and let's see what that looks like. So we get all of these characters as well. Remember, we could just literally call any number we want here, and it's just going to give us that character. Now, another interesting thing we can do with E is access infinity, right? Just by giving it this absolutely massive number, we can have access to the word infinity. There's actually literally loads of ways you could do this. You could just do a really big maths calculation, or you can literally just create this an absolutely huge number, right? We have access to all the numbers that we want, and so if we give it enough numbers, eventually it's not going to be able to handle that and just spits out the word infinity. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take every string that we have here and we're going to add them into this website regexer, right? And we're basically just going to create this very big character set of characters that we might have access to. Let's just forget those square brackets because we already have access to them anyway. And let's just add everything here. So basically this is going to let us easily see which characters we have available to us. So let's say we want the word alert, right? Well, we have access to a couple of those characters. We're still missing an A though, so we're going to need to find some way of getting A. So, but what else can we do? Well, what we wanted access to was the word fill and the word constructor, right? So awesome, we can actually build those in our own special limited way and have those output as strings. Now, what you could do is go character by character, go F, okay, I want the character F, and let's say you want to take the word infinity, right? And then you would set out the word infinity, and then you would set your value to F, and then that would be your value for F. Write that down, and then go on to the next character, I. However, I think it's much easier to write a script. So here is that script. It basically just takes a bunch of inputs, a bunch of outputs for each one, and it's going to search through and see if any of it. We basically give it a string, it converts it into an array, goes character by character, searches all of those outputs to see if it exists in any of those outputs, and if it does, it will spit us out the required string, right? So if I now open the console, well, this is what we were given. So let's take that without the quotes. And then let's go back into our console. So we put in the word fill, and we can see that we did in fact create the word fill. And if you put in something that you can't do, let's say the word alert, which we already know we can't do, we'll say no match found for A, so we know we can't use it. So now let's do the same for constructor, right? So we'll take the word constructor, we'll come in here and we will generate the characters that we need, and we will take all of those, we will come back in here and we will replace the word constructor with our homemade legal character setup of the word constructor. We'll hit enter on that and it does execute. So again, let's take this entire string that we've just created and let's try and validate it against the regex, right? So again, we're still trying to do this part manually with the alert, and that's not good. We can't be doing that. We need to find a way to replace that, but we don't have access to the letter A, right? We still are looking for the letter A. So how are we going to get that? Well, we are pretty much out of ideas on ways that we can generate strings with the limited characters that we have. So of all the legal characters, there were not many things I had left. However, I did find this $sign, right? Which is a function. It's actually a really shorthand way that Google added, but I think has also been added to Firefox to basically do document.query selector. So let's stringify that. So if we do this and we pass in our $, great, we've got a bunch of extra characters here. Now, There is a problem with this because actually, although we have it defined here, we are inside the browser. This is a very specific browser thing. You cannot use this inside of a code. It's undefined, basically. The moment it hits that eval, you get an error. It's undefined. So I have to find a new way. So at this point, I was a little bit stuck because I had kind of run out of things that I could use with our legal characters to generate us any kind of new characters, right? But then I got thinking, actually, we could use characters that are considered illegal because we can generate them, right? So for example, here, the good thing about this this $ here is that we got access to all of these characters which were part of a function, right? So why don't we just call our own function using the characters that we can generate? So for example, let's just say we create ourselves an empty string, right? And we know that we can access anything on that empty string. So in this case, let's say we want to do includes, right? Well, this is a function, right? We've got access to very similar stuff, and we can turn that into a string in a whole different bunch of ways, right? So now we can use the fact that we can generate this string includes, which we can do if we check here. We've got access to the word includes in the characters that we have, and we can use that to access even more characters. So let's change this into a entirely legal way of creating this string, right? So we already know we pass in our empty string, and let's do, instead of doing this plus whatever, let's use the same template string that we've been using before. So let's do like this. So now we've got our string as part of a template. We pass out an empty string called .includes. So let's replace the word includes with our generated string. So we'll go back over to our code. We'll do the word includes, and here is the string we want. So we get our includes, and we literally just replace it with that string we just copied over. And now when we hit enter, we are able to access this entire thing as a string. And let's say we want the letter A. Wow, that's quite far in. What is it, 18? There you go, 24, right? So we'll add this back into our new script so we can use this entire massive string that we just generated here to generate even more characters, just like the letter A. So now let's modify our code so that we can use this to generate stuff. So let's show what it looked like before, right? We try and type in the word alert, and it can't be done because the letter A does not exist. So we will take our code here, and we will just add a new object, and we will add, so we just put our input in here, and we will then put our output in the bottom half down here. And then hopefully when we hit our thing, we are doing it with alert, and we will take that and check, did it work? So let's have a look. We did in fact create the word alert, and as we can see, it is entirely legal. We are not using any character that is being filtered out, so we are pretty much done. So I'm actually just going to add one quick last simple thing in here, which is literally just to do a calculation of 10 divided by 3. Those are all completely allowed characters, and that gives us something like 3.333. Doesn't really matter because we're always going to get this second position here, right? And the reason is just because I want to have access to this dot so that I could literally just pass in here alert with the brackets, because we can get the brackets from down here, and we will just do document.domain. Again, the dot is actually allowed, but it's cool to have the entire thing just kind of generated for you in one huge thing. So if we check that, as we can see, it does in fact give us document.domain in our alert. Now, don't forget, we are actually quite far along. The only thing we are even trying to do here is replace this alert1. And we already know that we can replace that with alert document.domain with what we've got here. So if we take that and we literally replace our alert1 in here, we've got to put it inside of the template literals because we need this executed in a JavaScript context. Otherwise, it's just a big string. And we will paste that entire thing and we will hit go. And it doesn't work. So this is going to be an absolute mess to try and debug, but it is possible, right? And the way we can do that is just by literally replacing what we did with the fill and the constructor and what we're passing it to, and we'll just give it console.log instead, and we'll stop trying to execute console.log and just give it the alert1, and we can see what happens now. Now, this is not realistic enough, right? Because we're inside of a JavaScript context, so we're using these extra things here, right? So let's just literally see what happens if we passed it in a number 1, right? So this is weird. We're getting an array here with 2 completely empty elements, and then as a second parameter, it's passing in our 1 here. And now this is the nuanced difference that I was talking about earlier when it comes to normal parentheses, curly brackets, compared with the backticks when you're trying to call a function, right? So basically, because these are tag templates, everything that you pass before the tags, which is what we have to be inside in order to get a JavaScript context, everything that you pass before that ends up as an array and is passed in as the first parameter. And anything inside of these ends up being the second, third, fourth, whatever parameter that gets passed to the function, right? So this is a kind of a good example of what's going on. The words I like ends up in here, and the dot at the end also ends up being the second part of this array, but as the actual second parameter that's passed into the function, that's whatever is being kind of evaluated inside of this template literal. However, this is super easy to fix because if we look at how the constructor works, we can see that it basically takes any arguments first. So in this case, we're just giving it A and B, and those are just ending up as the actual parameter names for that function. And then whatever the last parameter is, that is going to be our function body. So let's actually see this in action, right? If I now call this and we give it any value at all, we can see it creates us this anonymous function that just tries to execute that random string. And that's not what we want, right? So what we're actually trying to do here is we're giving it a string inside of these brackets, because remember, what we're evaluating to is a string. So for the sake of this, I'll just use single quotes to represent that. And we're then doing alert document.domain. Now we can see exactly what happens, right? It's the same error, unexpected token. Now again, let's roll back to what console.log looks like with this exact thing. And we've got these empty things here, and that's not very good, right? Our document body's in here, but these are supposed to be the parameter names, right? According to this, these A and B, they're just empty. So how can we get around this? It's actually super simple. We have access to the letter E. We'll just use that as the name of our parameter name, just to satisfy the syntax, right? So now that's getting passed in. Well, what can we do now? Now we can go and do our original thing here, and we'll just pass that E in. And now we can see exactly what it gives us, right? It's creating us a function with a parameter name of E, which doesn't even get used. It's just purely there to satisfy the syntax and let us do this. And then it is giving us this alert document.domain as the body, right? And so from there, we can then run that just like this, and it will alert us, right? And we can do the same, obviously, with backticks. So let's just start over because we have no chance of ever achieving that. So let's just go from where we were before. Let's take our alert in here. Remember, we have to be inside of a JavaScript context because we are evaluating these into individual characters. So actually, let's not forget our magic E, which sits at the beginning to make everything valid. We put everything in and hit enter, and it fires. So now all we have to do is verify, yep, not a single character here is disallowed. We are writing the entire thing ourselves. We pass it into an URL encoder to make sure that there's no issues with plus signs and all that stuff. And we will set that as our value of C. We will hit enter. It gives us this horrible massive string in here. But when we click submit, it fires and we solve the challenge. And so that is the end. Basically, a super awesome challenge. I literally love stuff like this. Just totally dead, simple, straightforward. Just write the JavaScript, but don't use any of these characters. Go and figure it out. Look at what you have available.